There is a moment, somewhere in history, that repeats itself with unsettling regularity. It does not begin with violence. It does not begin with laws. It begins with a word, a label, a comparison, a quiet signal sent from the powerful to everyone else that a certain group of people is not quite like the rest of us. That they are a burden, a parasite, a pest. And once that word lands in the public conversation, everything that comes after it becomes easier to justify. This is not a coincidence. This is a strategy, and it is older than any government, any ideology, or any political system alive today. Psychologists call it dehumanization, the process of stripping a group of people of their perceived humanity in the minds of others. And the reason powerful people do it first, before anything else, is because it works quietly, efficiently, and almost invisibly. The human brain is wired for empathy. When we see another person suffering, something in us responds. A pull, an instinct, a recognition that says, that could be me. That shared humanity is one of the most powerful brakes on cruelty that nature ever built into us. But dehumanization disables that brake. When a person is described not as a struggling human being, but as a cockroach, a parasite, a drain on society, the brain begins, slowly and without conscious awareness, to process them differently. The part of the brain that activates when we think about other people, their feelings, their intentions, their inner lives, goes quieter. The empathy response dims, and in that dimming, space opens up. Space for policies that would have seemed unthinkable before. Space for cruelty that now feels like common sense. Space for a population to watch suffering happen and feel nothing much. This is why dehumanization always comes first. It is not an accident of emotion. It is preparation. Researchers at Stanford and Princeton have documented this pattern across cultures and across centuries. The language used against Jewish people in 1930s Germany. The language used against Tutsi people in Rwanda before 1994. The language used against migrants, against the unemployed, against the poor, in country after country, generation after generation. The words change. The function never does. And here is the part that most people miss. Dehumanization does not only affect the people it targets, it affects everyone who hears it, including the people who believe they are immune to it. When dehumanizing language enters everyday conversation, when it appears in speeches, in headlines, in casual political commentary, it begins to shift what psychologists call the Overton window. The range of ideas that feel acceptable, normal, sayable, out loud. A word that would have caused outrage 5 years ago becomes a talking point. A comparison that would have seemed extreme becomes a joke. And somewhere in that slow normalization, something in the collective moral imagination quietly moves. The powerful understand this, not always consciously, not always with a detailed plan, but the pattern is consistent enough, across enough different times and places, that its function is clear. You do not dehumanize the people you respect. You do not compare to insects the people whose dignity you intend to protect. The language reveals the intention before the intention reveals itself. But here is what history also shows. With equal consistency, it does not always work. There is a psychological phenomenon that researchers have observed in groups that face dehumanization together. When people are targeted collectively, when an entire generation, an entire class, an entire demographic is told that they are less, that they are a problem, that they do not deserve the dignity of being taken seriously, something unexpected can happen. Shared humiliation becomes shared identity. The label meant to isolate becomes the thing that connects. The insult meant to silence becomes the reason to speak. And the anger, the very real, very human anger that rises when a person is told they are not quite human, does not dissolve, it organizes. This is the psychological miscalculation that power makes, again and again. It assumes that people who have been made to feel small will stay small. It forgets that humiliation, when it reaches a certain pitch, does not produce compliance. It produces clarity. People begin to see the strategy for what it is. They begin to name it, and naming it, understanding the mechanism behind the word, the function behind the label, is one of the most powerful things a person can do, because you cannot be psychologically manipulated by a tool you can clearly see. So what do you do when you are on the receiving end of dehumanizing language? From an institution, from a system, from people who hold power over parts of your life. You do not have to perform dignity for people who have decided not to see it. You do not have to convince anyone of your humanity. That is not your job, and it was never your job. What you can do is refuse to internalize the label. The research on psychological resilience is clear on this point. The most important protective factor when a person faces dehumanization is whether they are able to separate how they are described from how they understand themselves. The word someone else chooses for you is information about them. It is not a definition of you. You can name the mechanism, loudly, clearly, and without drama. When dehumanizing language is called out for what it is, a strategy, a historical pattern, a documented psychological tactic, it loses a significant portion of its power. Darkness does not survive being described in daylight, and you can stay connected to other people because isolation is always the goal of dehumanization, and community is always its most effective answer. The brain that is wired for empathy is also wired for belonging. And belonging, real belonging, the kind that forms between people who recognize each other's humanity precisely because someone tried to take it away, is extraordinarily difficult to break. They called people parasites. They called people cockroaches. They called people a burden on a system that had already failed them. And the people looked at each other and recognized something, and they were not afraid anymore.